right. You know, we're already in a good mood, so this is great. Welcome back to the Untold Civil War. This is our second episode on the Herb Peck Collection of Civil War photography, this infamous case in the community. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the details of the case, we do have that audio episode going up at the same time, so please refer to that. And this is where we're going to discuss some of the images that are going up for auction in Adam Fleischer's auctions here. We've had him on the show, great friend of the show. Glad to feature his website here. And I guess we're going to just discuss some of the images. I'm with Ron Coddington and Kevin Canberg. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Briefly, as we get into this, for those who may have not listened to the audio yet, Ron, do you want to just quickly describe the case, the story behind this before we get into this, just to catch people up?
Sure. Just a quick summary. Herb Peck, a charismatic collector, photographer at Vanderbilt University, had a marvelous collection of Confederate images, had a passion for them, and also antebellum military and Nashville area images. He had them all in his house, in his study. 1978, there is a theft of the largest part of his collection. Most of that collection disappeared until 2006, when one surfaced. 2020, 39 more were recovered in a raid. Still out there, about 70 or so, 60 or 70 that are missing. And what we're seeing here are the recovered images, which are now being put up for auction.
And Kevin, you've actually handled these images, right?
I have. So I had the great good fortune of working with Fleischer's Auctions as their consulting director of photography, and so I had the chance to write the catalog for this sale, which is unique because we are selling this exclusively as a group. It was one collection, and so there are 49 lots. All of the lots are the recovered images from the Peck collection that were stolen in 1978. So it's about as close as this community can come to buried treasure, I guess. Stuff that was once thought destroyed or missing forever is now available to enjoy and potentially add to your own collection.
So here's one image that stood out to me, I should say, being from New York, and I live in New York, so I really like this image. Now, I did do some research on this image, and what I have discovered that, as you can see, that is in fact a very good dog right there. He's a very good dog.
He's a very good boy.
Yeah, very good boy. But what are we looking at here? I don't know if Kevin, would you like to share with us what you saw when you actually got to handle this image?
Sure. This one threw me for a loop, actually. When I first saw it, because Herb's specialty was Southern photographs. He really focused his collection on images of Southern soldiers, of Confederate soldiers, photos made in what we would consider the South of the United States. And so when I saw this, I said, well, this must be a pair of like Virginia militiamen, or I'll see if I can find the uniform. In fact, it turns out they are New Yorkers. So how they slipped in is anyone's guess. Perhaps there was, confusion at the time as to where these folks hailed from, and that would be totally understandable given the sometimes very challenging world of Civil War uniforms. But what we're seeing here is a quarter plate ambrotype that was probably made in the late 1850s. I believe one of the gentlemen is an officer. Sort of a very casual, relaxed pose where they're sort of leaning back in their chairs, and they have this extremely relaxed dog, kind of mirroring their own posture, resting on the ground. Just a fun image. We don't see a lot of period photography with dogs, although you do encounter them occasionally, particularly military photography. It's very, very difficult to find images with any kind of animal companion. So, this one just kind of makes me smile. It's a little less, military in bearing. Maybe it's a little less blood and guts than the typical military image, but the inclusion of the dog makes it special. I think it's a photograph that kind of transcends just specifically a military collector.
Well, there's great beards in this image. But Ron, I'm looking at this image and it looks like the coats could possibly be very light gray. And Ron, that has to mean they're Confederate, right? That's a gray jacket. It has to be Confederate, right?
Case closed.
Yeah, exactly. Say no more.
Yeah.
So
no,
there are different uniforms, right?
Yeah, absolutely different uniforms. And I can understand, to Kevin's point earlier, about how this could be mistaken for a pair of Southern soldiers, although the loyalty of the dog is unknown, I think it's fair to say. But you think about photography of the time period in the South, 1861, 1862, when the soldiers were getting their photographs taken, is when they wore those early militia uniforms. And those uniforms were just specialized. They were unique to the town that the militia unit was formed. And then as photography supplies begin to disappear, as the Union Army invades and as the blockades do their job, you begin to see the portrait, the ability to get a portrait made, that also goes away. So when you see these early images of Southern soldiers, you oftentimes are seeing either those very early war images when they're dressed in those militia uniforms, or you're seeing an image taken at the end of the war when they want to pose one more time. And by that time, they normally have more of the classic Confederate gray or butternut that we think of today.
So what else do we have here? Now, yes, this one's very interesting too, because we talk about interesting armaments. Was this very typical, this Bowie knife here, if we can call it that, this D-guard Bowie knife?
There are definitely themes in Confederate photography. And I don't think there is a more iconic item in a Confederate photograph than a Bowie knife, a very large Bowie knife. Most of them, I think we would kind of refer to as D-guard handle knives, where the handle of the knife literally resembles the letter D, like the guard over the knuckles is sort of the curve of the D. But these soldiers loved to pose with those knives. It's funny, you look at images of Union soldiers, and they will often have a knife tucked in their belt, or some other fearsome weapon, but rarely do they hold it up like that. Whether they like hold it across their chest, or sort of and it's a theme kind of that transcends even what state the photo was taken in, and what Confederate state the photo was taken in. I always found that sort of fascinating. So to me, it's really kind of almost like an emblem of the Confederacy, or at least the Confederate soldier. And so what you have here is very unusual, because the format is actually a daguerreotype. So daguerreotypes were largely out of favor by the time the Civil War rolled around. They're really the first medium for photography from the 1840s on. But again, by the war, they were, it was obsolete. But there were still operators, a rare few who were probably working through an old supply, or just that's what they had access to. And here's how you explain how you come up with not the only known example, but one of a few examples of a Southern photograph, a Civil War time Southern photograph, that is actually a daguerreotype, an earlier process.
Ron,
I'll add one thing. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask Ron, when we look at this image, can we tell, is there a way to know if these D-guard knives were used in the field, they were owned by the soldiers, or are these props? Do we know the difference between the two?
I don't know that we can say with 100% certainty, but I can tell you that from studies that we've done that have appeared in the magazine, there's enough variation in these weapons to suggest that they belonged to the soldiers, and there certainly was a tradition in the South of having them. So I have no doubt that they were mostly owned by the soldiers themselves. Having said that, there is documentary evidence of photographers who had props and also coached the individuals how to pose, depending upon getting the most favorable conditions for a portrait. And so there's those things to consider. So the short answer is there's no real definite answer that you can give on this one way or the other. But I will also add that this guy, what you're seeing here is, this is a Marshall portrait. He wants us to see that big honking Bowie knife, right? He's like, here it is. I've got it. It's so big, I'm resting it on my shoulder. It's like, I can almost not pick it up. And then he's holding the musket. He's gripping that musket in the other hand. These are all the signs of a Marshall portrait. He wants us to see these things.
Yeah.
This is intentional. Now, Austin Sundstrom, who is a part of the collecting community, he did a thesis for a project and looking at different ways to think about photography. And his theory is that this represents the Marshall view, that how a soldier wanted to be seen. The other version of that is the restrained portrait. So when you see a soldier who is cradling his sword or has the gun off to the side and it's not in your face, that's the restrained category, the opposite of Marshall. These restrained images value family, home, values, business success. So another way to think about, another way that I think about the portraits when I'm seeing them, and this one just screams, I'm a soldier.
Well, for sure, I think he's telling everyone that this is no Tiffany's knife. You know, this is the real deal. And if you see anything you'd like to look at, let me know. I mean, I'm just scrolling here because they're all really great images.
There's if that one on the left there in that row is probably one of my favorites from the whole sale. Again, you have this theme, you know, that sort of Marshall theme. You know, you can see his uniform is somewhat simple. It has these big ivory or bone buttons. It's sort of, you know, clearly not made, you know, not mass produced in a factory somewhere. You know, but if you know, one of my favorite features of what makes a photograph great to me is clarity. You know, I think these are little works of art. And this is just a remarkable portrait. It's so crystal clear. And you can, you know, when you zoom in, you can kind of tell like this was a kid a week, you know, a day before this photo was made, he was just a kid. And now he's in a uniform, he's holding this enormous weapon, and he's ready to go fight. He probably has no idea what that means, but he's going to go do it anyway for whatever the motivation was. And so there's this sort of improbability kind of inherent in this portrait that really gets to me. You know, it's just it's hard for me to you know, reconcile you know, such a young person, probably, you know, with a full life ahead of them, you know, just sort of immediately thrown into this conflict and turned into someone who may very well have died, you know, along the way. So it's just there's something haunting about it. It's so clear. You can kind of, you can read too much into these for sure, and I try not to do that. But I think this one kind of stands alone as just a uniquely powerful Civil War era photograph.
Absolutely. Ron, what do you tell people when they come, they see your collection or visit, and you know, the first thing that most people tell me when they look at my photos is, wow, the case is so beautiful and shiny, you know? And I'm looking and I'm like, do you not see the contents of the image? But what about the cases? How do they bring us into this image, for example?
Well, the first thing I tell people, it's not for sale.
Yeah.
Unless they've got something that I want.
Right, yes.
Yeah, there's something about the hard plate images, and when I say hard plate, I'm talking about the ambrotypes and the tintypes. These images were one of a kind. They were sort of art pieces in their own way, as compared to the paper images that were mass produced from a negative. These images, because they were one of a kind, and the way they were treated in a case, it certainly is decorative, but it's also protective, because the surfaces, the emulsion surfaces, whether it was on tin and iron plate or on glass, was fragile stuff. So you want to protect them. So having a glass on top of it, having a brass mat, having a preserver that wraps it all together, placed in a case, all is a useful way to really be archival during the 1860s. It also, I think, adds to the emotional connection because they have those beautiful frames. It accentuates the personality and the personal, intimate nature of these photographs.
Yeah.
Also important to note here that we're looking at this image in reverse. The technology of the times, they were able to actually correct for reversal photographs, or a reversal problem that was common to tintypes and ambrotypes. But it was an expensive fix, and most folks just got accustomed to it. But these personal, individual reversed objects, these wonderful photographs, when you gave it to somebody, you're giving them your reflection. And that increases that level of intimacy and that personal connection. So when I see the mat and the frame, that's where my brain goes.
And that's why sometimes you'll see like Union soldiers with US on their belt buckle, and it's actually upside down because they wanted to have the U and S at least on the right side, I guess you could say. It wasn't a political statement. It was just because they knew the image would come out in reverse, right?
Yeah, that's a great point because prior to the war, when people were dressed in civilian clothing and not uniforms, you didn't have occasions where things needed to be reversed. A vest, a coat, a bonnet generally was symmetrical. But then all of a sudden you put on a US or a CS buckle, you have a company insignia, company letter on a cap, and that becomes backwards. It's like, well, why is that? And soldiers and sailors would go to great lengths to try to reverse that and make it look genuine, including flipping belts over to put the sword belt on the opposite side so that it looked like it was on the right side.
Well, Kevin, I think we have an example right here of reverse lettering. And is this something you were mentioning earlier, this image?
It was. So this is you know, of all the photographs in the sale, and there are some truly amazing photographs in the sale. This probably is the one that I'm most connected to personally, because it sort of, you know, it was kind of a small world situation. So what we know about this photo, and it's one of the great things about this, you know, Civil War photography generally is, you know, the more you study them, the more you see them, you start to pick up on themes, you start to pick up on trends, and these things start to like reveal themselves to you, even if you purchase them or you find them with no backstory whatsoever. So, you know, this image, it can be hard to place where a Confederate soldier was from just by looking at the uniform. There's often a lot of cross-pollination across different Confederate states, although there were some consistencies within the states themselves. But what I see when I saw this picture for the first time is that it was made by a specific photographer. We don't know who they were, what their name was, but we know from other examples that they operated most likely in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, probably on the earlier side of the war. And a lot of the soldiers that this photographer took photos of were a part of Stonewall Jackson's brigade. And so, you know, they all tend to follow the same format where they're sitting at a table, they have their arm sort of resting on this little side table, they're holding their musket with the lock plate out directly towards the lens. It's sort of a incredible clarity. This was a highly talented operator. They made wonderful photographs. But what we learned as we researched this catalog, or these images to build the catalog, is that this is actually a member of the 1st Tennessee Infantry. And, you know, query why a member of the 1st Tennessee Infantry would have been out in Virginia early in the war. Well, the reason is because there were a few regiments sent out east, and they did fight, you know, with Stonewall Jackson. And so this Tennessean found himself in the same studio that many Virginians did in the very early stages of the war. But what brought it home for me was the 2 letters on his hat, which appear backwards, as Ron has explained kind of the science behind that. But those 2 letters are FG. And we know from other identified examples that are not in the Herb Peck collection that the FG stands for, or the initials of his company's nickname. One of the fun things about Confederate regiments were that their individual companies often had sometimes really wild nicknames. And this particular company's nickname was the Fayetteville Guards. Fayetteville is a small town in central South Tennessee, where my in-laws happen to be from. And so it was a real kind of a holy, this is kind of a wild coincidence that I'm putting together this catalog, and I'm sort of face to face with someone who may very well have known, the ancestors of the person I'm married to. So, putting all that aside, I think what you have here is just a superlative example of Southern photography, a very talented operator who captured an interesting character nearly flawlessly, that we can enjoy some 165 years later.
Guards definitely is a pretty good nickname. I think I'll stand by that one. I think that one was a pretty good choice there. I don't know if, Ron, you bumped into any nicknames that you enjoyed or thought were odd.
Yeah, I don't know that any immediately come to mind, although sunflower dispersers from down in Mississippi is certainly a great one of the better suggestions. There's so many running through my mind because as I'm researching, I always like to try to find out what the name of that Southern militia company was. And I do notice that in probably those militia companies that formed in early 1861 is when you start seeing Jeff Davis appear and Avengers and things like that. It starts getting a bit more, you start to get into personalities and names that are more geared towards the foe, the enemy. So, and also in the sense of defending the country. Yeah, that's where it starts to go. You start to see those militia names begin to tweak a little bit as a result of the conflict.
Well, Kevin, I know that people get very excited about musicians, and I could be wrong. I'm just kind of looking here. But in the 19th century, no one smiled for images, right? And is there a smirk here? Is this breaking protocol?
I think so. So there are some folks that have very strong opinions about smiling in period images. The exposure time is usually what is blamed for the lack of smiling. The exposure time was not that long, and you do come across the occasional photograph of a soldier or some other person with a big old grin on their face. I think it's more of just the sensibilities at the time, more so than the exposure. While you see people tend to be more stern, a little more serious in these photos. Here you have a classic fifer and drummer, right? The iconic sound of the Civil War. And you have a somewhat rarer Southern example where you have, instruments that may have been brought from home or something of that nature, as opposed to something that was issued and has all the trappings of like a design on it. These are just plain unadorned instruments who are, being played for the enjoyment of, well, I guess in the studio at this point, I guess this is really for the enjoyment of the folks back home. But, this is about as iconic as a Civil War musician photograph gets.
Now, Kevin, I noticed there's some wear on the edges of the image, a sort of halo, right? When you're handling these images, is there certain wear and tear that you look for that is typical of an authentic image, and how does that separate it from, if you're looking at a fake reproduction, for example?
Excellent. It can be an image to determine like the authenticity of an image can be kind of almost a fully sensory experience. One is that old things always smell old. It's very hard to replicate the smell of something that's 165 years old. So give it a sniff. That'll be, it's weird, but it actually does kind of work. But with respect to photographs, I mean, what you see here is kind of a classic wear pattern. That halo around the image is sometimes referred to as solarization. We think it comes from contact with oxygen. So, over time, you probably closer to when it was made, sort of the reaction of the chemicals with oxygen created that kind of, I happen to think it's kind of neat, kind of halo effect around the image. That's extremely difficult to fake. But I don't think that halo is typical either. So it's sort of it's not unique, but it's you won't see it on every single image. It really depends on like the quality of the materials that we're being used in the first place to make the image. There's a lot of science involved in these, which is another kind of thing that interests me just about photography, early photography in general. But you'll see, this is an ambrotype. You'll notice a few of the images in the Herb Peck collection that are going to be offered at auction actually are broken. They have cracks in them. I mean, I think we talked about it before. I mean, these are fragile. They're in cases for the most part, but they were often mailed without a case. They were knocked off of a shelf, or a cat got to it, or something like that over the years. And so, it's, sometimes they have scratches from mishandling. Oftentimes they'll have what look like white marks, where people think they can clean them. Probably well-meaning people that thought that it could clean them, and found out after one kind of swipe that was a mistake, and it took some of the emulsion off, leaving that swipe behind, and that's irreversible damage. So, the more you look at these, you can start to see the way that time and handling, honest time and handling kind of impact these, like you see here. I think it just adds to the character of these things. It's patina. But in answer to your question, I think, even though I took the long road to answering it, I think what you're seeing here is a good way to determine whether or not something is authentic.
Well, Ron, when you look at this image, maybe you can talk about the role of musicians here. So what would it be a typical role of a musician in the Civil War? What were they doing? Were they just the band leading the march? Were they used for signaling, or what was their role?
They're underappreciated, I think, perhaps today, because the necessity of having a drummer and a fifer to lead you into battle, marching in a column, is not really part of modern warfare, I think we could say. So we forget how important they were. They were incredibly important, and particularly the fifer and the drummer, because they had a particular function to play to keep the men together, to organize them around drills, and even in battles can play an important role. The other musicians you don't see here are the folks who carry all the brass instruments. They're also important. The brass bands, which were recruited from some of the best musicians around. And there were competitions between regiments and brigades and divisions about who had the best bands, particularly in the North. And so I think about those brass band, those saxophone players who were all talented and did great things, not quite as important on the battlefield, but important for morale behind the front lines.
Now, I know there was an article in Military Images magazine by Ron Field, Ugly as the Devil, talking about some of the ugliest hats in the Civil War. But this is some pretty impressive headgear. I think this plume is great. So, Kevin, what are we looking at here?
It's great, but probably totally impractical. Just ridiculous on its face, but makes for a cool picture. I think that's what we're looking at here. I think folks that enlisted and who joined the cavalry, often saw themselves maybe as like cavaliers, like true, like historic cavaliers, in that image. And I think what you're seeing here is a young citizen turned soldier who tried to capture that essence for a photograph, probably early in the war. You'll often see, soldiers from that branch of service dressed in similar ways, maybe a little more ostentatious, a little bit more of a peacock, maybe, just to sort of lean into that historic, like the romantic nature of the horse soldier, the soldier on horseback. So it's what we're seeing here, I think, is a great example of someone who really wanted to appear like this for the recipient of this picture, as opposed to what they probably looked like in their day-to-day soldiering.
For sure, this looks like, maybe a Three Musketeer, right? Like this is D'Artagnan.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Right.
Exactly.
And when I'm looking at this, I see sort of a canvas in the background, Ron. Would that be what they call the backdrop, even though it's plain?
It is, and it would be considered a backdrop or a background. and they tell us a little bit. They can provide additional information. A blank canvas backdrop can often be symptomatic of a field studio that was set up by a photographer traveling to the various encampments and other places to make some money, make a lot of money, because you had soldiers with pay who were wearing fancy plumed hats and other accessories and wanted to send a photograph home to mom and dad or fiance, wife, girlfriend, brother and sister, that sort of a thing. So that suggests to me that this might have been taken in that kind of environment. And as you suggested, you mentioned blank. There's also the painted backdrops, which are particularly useful because the scenes that are painted on those backdrops, which range from bucolic meadows with peaceful lakes and sailboats to military encampments with cannons and everything else and Sibley tents all arranged. Those painted backdrops or backgrounds can help us identify soldiers, or at least identify the locations if we have enough images of a particular backdrop, and some of the individuals pictured in those photographs are identified. Then we can start to triangulate and get a sense of where the unidentified individual posed for that photograph. I'm one step closer to an ID, but not all the way there.
Now, I know we don't want to give our favorite image away. You don't want to feature the one you're going to be bidding on, right? Like, you don't want people to pay attention to that at all. But are there any other images that stand out?
Stop right there.
Right here, right? Okay.
Go to that first one.
Yeah.
When I was, I went down to Nashville twice on reporting trips to interview Felicity and Bruce. And on the second trip was sort of a follow-up interview, and also scanning all of the negatives and scanning the images. And all of the images, before they were handed off to Fleischer's auctions and to Kevin, they were all in a big plastic tub. Might have been the same tub that Adam got, all wrapped up in various things, as collectors do. And I'm dutifully going through each one. And when this one came out of whatever wrapping it was in, there's something about the way he's holding the sword, the beard, the scabbard, the clarity of the image. I felt like he was just going to lean out of that chair and get up and tell me that I was a captured prisoner of war. Just really, it really spoke to me.
This is definitely one of my favorites as well. And I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. And the thing that jumps out to me is the paper matte. You'll see if you're familiar with these, or you're getting familiar with these through this video, most images have a brass housing. There's a brass mat and keeper. It kind of makes a sandwich to keep the image safe under glass. This photographer did not have those components, and so they approximated it with basically like gold crepe paper to mimic the effect without having the actual tools in the toolbox. And that's a real hallmark of Southern photography, early Southern photography. It's one of the things I find most fascinating about it, as a matter of fact, is when you find this occasional early image that they were still making these photographs even though they didn't have all the tools to do so. It was a bit ingenious, frankly. And it just, I think, adds to the kind of the mystique or the interest of this image. It's a real unique, great example.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, because I think that's something that really does stand out when you talk about the Confederacy as a whole and collecting Confederate materials. One of the favorite things I actually have in my collection is a Confederate sword. Now, I'm not really a sword collector, but the fact that it has a wooden scabbard, just a plain wooden scabbard, stood out to me as sort of the, just the bare bones of some of the Confederate materials that they were using, and this is a great example of that. And so he's a it looks like he's a sergeant.
I think you can just see stripes. It's a little small in my view, but if I recall, I think he does have chevrons on his sleeves.
So probably if he's a sergeant, would he be like a cavalryman because he has that saber, or because I don't really know about infantry sergeants holding a sword, or could be something different, right?
He could be a non-commissioned officer.
Yeah, you got it, Ron. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, it could be probably a non-commissioned officer.
Got it.
Anyway, I'm just gonna, you don't need to bid on that one.
We'll keep that in mind. I think my favorite is probably the last one in the last lot of the auction.
Okay, let's head over there.
Not going to reveal whether or not. I mean, it's hard to like. I've spent a lot of time with these now, and I'm sort of like, it's hard to pick like which one you think is the best or which one you like the best. But outside of that one that I sort of have a connection to, let's talk about this one for a second, for sure. That one that you just popped up. You don't even have to re-click on it. I'll just. That was actually one of the images that popped up on eBay, and that was actually the image that cracked the case. And one of the crazy things about this was when someone realized that this was a Herb Peck image, it was still live on eBay. We were trying to like get the seller to like reveal more about who they were and what else they had. And another collector was successful in getting this individual to send other pictures of this image, and one of them where the image was out of its case. So this person, and I don't know who they are, was kind of an amateur. And I just remember the pictures were sent were like he was filthy, like his hands were filthy, like he must have worked with his hands or whatever, and he was holding this plate, and I was like, oh man, like it's kind of a miracle that some of this stuff survived. That was probably the best example. Like he may not have had any awareness of how much these things could be worth or how fragile they were, and it was just like seeing this thing uncased in like a garage was like, it was just kind of troubling to think about what, how many of these could have been destroyed, or how this one indeed could have been destroyed. But through some divine intervention, perhaps this was no worse for wear when it was recovered.
No, that's great work. That's great work. I'm not going to ask about the interrogation process. I don't want to know about the light shining in people's faces, but I am glad that this was recovered. Yeah, and hopefully this will go to somebody, and it should, right? It's going to go to somebody who actually does know how to take care of it, who will preserve it for generations.
I know that's what Herb would have wanted.
Let's see. And now you said in the second page, right? There's some few over here.
I think yeah. If we were kind of going into this like favorite one category, there's some really extraordinary things in here.
Before we get there, this was the cover of the
that was
the Military Images magazine, right? Of the edition.
Why? I'd be interested to know, Ron, why? Yeah.
Yeah. As much as I gave away my particular favorite, this image just spoke to me because of the content. The unusual Havelock style hat with the rain covering, the weapon, the haversack. It just there's just so much going on. There's so much so much to catch your eye and catch your attention. And the young man looks just impossible young. So to have all that together in one photograph, on top of that plain canvas backdrop and how it's in a beautiful case. There was several images that I looked at for the cover, as I normally do. And the moment I put this one into the template with our Military Images logo, it said, I'm the one.
That's wonderful. It is a fantastic image, and probably early war, right? You're not going to see hats like that later in the conflict.
No, that's actually a what would we call a wheel cap or a wheel hat, which was kind of almost like a Mexican War era hat that must have still been kicking around, in some militia somewhere in the South. And that Havelock was made to fit over that, which it was a big hat to begin with. That's why the Havelock itself is almost like a cape. It's really kind of a very unique, one-of-a-kind item to see in a photograph.
Like you said, sometimes you can dig a little too deep here, but when I see this image, you know, I kind of think of, why would you want to pose with this this hat and at least a havelock on it? You know, maybe you want to take it off, maybe it's wet outside, I don't know. But I guess if you're new to the military and you've got all this new equipment that you want to show off, you're going to put everything on and try to show off all the cool stuff that you have.
Or
like,
here's an alternative theory. Mom and Dad sent me a rain hat.
Yes. Yeah.
And guess what? I'm wearing it for you.
It's funny. I was actually reading a book on Todd's book on the 79th New York Highlanders, and they talk about how family members sent them a bunch of havelocks to wear around First Manassas First Bull Run, and they were too hot in Virginia. And so oftentimes they were taken off and just used to wipe down their muskets and clean their weaponry or equipment. But in their letters, they wrote, "Oh yeah, keep sending them. We love them. Thank you so much." You know, so I can see that as well. So is it?
A lot of these guys also had no frame of reference for what a soldier really looked like. You know, like they didn't have a bunch of photographs to look through. The regular army was really tiny. Maybe they saw woodcuts of like what George Washington and the Continental Army looked like. So, you know, a lot of this was just feeling around in the dark. Most of the people in these photographs had, you know, couldn't have imagined they would ever be soldiers, you know, actively engaged in fighting a war, which is something I've always found fascinating about these things. So you're really just, a lot of this, I think, is like their best interpretation of what they thought a soldier should look like.
Right. I guess, you know, the epitome of the soldier back then, Napoleon, right? So you have all these guys who are doing that Napoleon stance, you know, whether they
absolutely
think it makes them look more martial or whatnot, but they're probably copying the paintings of the day, right?
Yep. They slip the hand into the jacket or under the lapel. That last one on the right there. It's funny how these things happen. Like they sort of reveal themselves to you the longer you spend with them and begin to appreciate them. The portrait itself is well executed. It's a little interesting because you have a painted backdrop behind it, which is not common for Southern photography at all. You know, he's got a kind of a compelling uniform on. You know, I think he's got all the trappings of you know, a Confederate soldier, probably at the beginning of the war. But one of the things I don't think we mentioned yet is that some of these images have identifications. Some of them are identified behind their cases or maybe by a note. This one is kind of in the middle ground, and while there was a note behind this image, and unfortunately the note doesn't actually include the name of this person, but it indicates that they were shot through the eye and died and never came home. And so it's just sort of like I think it's kind of a sad but fitting postscript, kind of to this whole, you know, just as a Civil War photograph. You know, it's just it's kind of everything you want. You know, it's a great representative example of a Southern infantryman and how they looked in 1861, 1862, whatever it was. And like many of them, they just didn't make it home. You know, they ran out of time, they ran out of steam. And so, you know, this was just sort of it encapsulates more than just a good photo to me. It tells you a little bit more about the futility of a lot of this, the sort of the hopelessness of this cause. And so, you know, for that reason, I think it's a very important photograph. That little extra piece of provenance behind it elevates it from me from just like a strong photo to an important piece of history. So, you know, today it's my favorite. Maybe I'll change that, you know, my mind as we get closer to the auction. But I couldn't kind of shake that, you know, that note when I was thinking about what my favorite was.
Well, I guarantee, and I'm not wishing this on you, but it'll definitely be your favorite if you don't win it, because that's how it is, right? You never win the one you actually love. That's the frustrating part, right? At least with me. So, but you know, best of luck for everyone. Ron, is there anything you'd like to say on this image?
No, I think Kevin covered it beautifully. Just a stunning example of a Southern soldier. And one thing maybe to add, as far as the note is concerned, one of the advantages of these hard plate images in these cases, the ambrotypes and tintypes, is you do find notes, poems, newspaper clippings, stuck inside. The paper photographs, those other paper images, they're easier to inscribe, and you usually find them inscribed. These will have notes which can help you identify, or at least give you some sense of the soldier's fate.
And you mentioned the backdrop before, that plain backdrop here. It's not plain, but it's definitely not the most elaborate backdrop for sure, but it is still a great example of a backdrop, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and certainly more scholarship needs to be done to try to connect this with other known images that have that same backdrop, and maybe will help us to learn more about this individual.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, talking about these images. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. And hopefully we can do this again when the auction is live. That would be a really fun day, I think. So
I
until
agree.
I
then,
will be there. I will be there in person. So I'm happy to live stream it if you're interested.
There may be a watch party in our feature.
yes, a watch party. Hopefully, we'll see some of the prices that come up. Hopefully there's not too much arguing and fighting, the fists.
Watch my bank account go up. I think that's the watch party we're really talking about here.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I'll let you know when this finally airs, which should be soon because the season is starting.
Awesome.
So thank you again. I appreciate it.
Sounds good. This was great fun.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Kevin, we'll see you soon.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.